All right, Herle Burlyites, thanks for joining us for our first podcast of 2022. We've got what I think is a great show today with a hell of a guest. But before we go there, just a reminder that if you like, or for that matter, don't like what you hear on our show, please consider giving us a rating or a review by navigating your way through the Apple Podcast Industrial Complex. I know it isn't easy, but it helps immensely with our reach, and more importantly, it makes me less likely to tweet when it's late at night and I'm a couple of rum and cokes in. I feel better about myself. All right, today on the show, a man who has played significant roles in my personal and political life as my friend, colleague, conscience, mentor, and teacher, Elly Alboim. If you don't know Elly, here are the professional facts. He was a journalist for the CBC for 23 years, becoming Parliamentary Bureau Chief for CBC Television News and National Political Editor for the network. Today, he's a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies, where he leads strategic communications and has advised government and industry on some of the most important issues of our time: the environment, finance, health and human resources, justice, and many more. He was a senior advisor to Paul Martin during his time as finance minister and prime minister, as well as serving on election steering committees for Mr. Martin and Premier Kathleen Wynne. And if all of that isn't enough, Elly is a tenured associate professor of journalism at Carleton University, specializing in television news and political reporting. And now the personal. I know Elly as somebody, well, Mike Robinson called him wise when he was still too young to be wise, but he always has been. And Elly is just somebody I don't do anything important without. If I can get him involved in it, I get him involved in it. If I can't get him involved in it, I seek his counsel and advice. Elly, I've always wanted to have you on this show. Thank you for joining us. It's really great to have you here.
Nice to be here. Also nice to hear your obituary before you're dead, even if it's somewhat overblown.
Hey, man, I haven't seen you in a while. How are you? How's your mentality at this point in the pandemic?
I'm fine. I'm one of those people who is vulnerable. So I kind of stick to my basement and work out of my basement. Got a big TV, no kids around to distract me. Get food delivered to the house. I'm fine.
Yeah, you don't feel this overall sense of angst or anxiety that, well, I'll just say that I feel about the overall situation.
Oh, I'd be silly if I said I didn't. You know, there's a continuous anxiety about whether I've been exposed in some way, whether my family's been exposed. My grandson got it. Thankfully, he's recovered. He's fine. He's back playing hockey. But no, of course, I don't think any of us are now in a circumstance where we don't know somebody or some number of people who've come down with it. So sure, the background is one of anxiety. But what do you do?
It's just weird.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell my audience a little bit about yourself. I know this stuff, but tell us before you worked at the CBC, who were you?
I'm one of those strange people who actually have only had 2 or 3 jobs in my entire life. So I went right out of school. I went to Columbia in New York to get my master's in journalism. And then started working for the CBC in Montreal almost immediately, a week before the October crisis, which was an education in itself, and stayed with the CBC, as you said, for 23 years. Then I joined Earnscliffe, and I've been there now for 28 years, with an academic career straddling both. But I haven't really done anything besides that.
But before university, you come from Montreal. You're an Anglo-Montrealer. You were one of those Westmount Rhodesians that was running the place back in the 60s. Is that
no,
the family you come from?
I'm from Montreal, but I'm a second generation Canadian. My parents were immigrants. My dad came over in the First World War. My mom came over just before the Second World War. She escaped Poland, actually, as the Germans were entering. I was born in Montreal, not in Westmount, in a suburb called Snowden. Great
Delhi.
Sorry?
Great Delhi.
Magnificent Delhi. Their party sandwiches are to die for. When I used to go to Montreal regularly, that would be a stop to bring them back for the family. I went to McGill in Montreal, was a student activist at the time, took sociology and anthropology, could not determine what use that would be to me in any way. So at the same time, I was working at the McGill Daily, which actually at the time was a functioning daily newspaper, and rose to the managing board of the Daily after 4 years. And I became, in effect, a full-time newspaper person. I didn't attend very many classes after September in my final year. I kind of mirrored your academic career in that level. And when I graduated, moved to Ottawa for a year to work for the Canadian University Press, fell in love with Ottawa and politics. And then, as I said, got my master's and came back to Canada to work on the CBC in Montreal.
Right. How do you think the Canadian media's handled COVID?
Oh boy, that's a complicated question, eh? It's treating it as a normal news story, with all of the baggage that entails. It has migrated over time, I think, a bit from the initial coverage patterns, which were much more about the pandemic, what can be done about it, public policy issues, public health issues, news people could use in terms of avoiding exposure, a kind of utilitarian consumer-based coverage. And then gradually, for a variety of reasons that we probably all know, it became more politicized. It became a search for accountability. It also became as the accountability lens opened up, a lot of journalists felt comfortable questioning the decisions by public health authorities and governments, obviously, and the relationship between the two, and developed what they believe to be significant expertise on the issues. We've now moved into, if the proportions were heavily tilted towards information and consumer-based information at the beginning, I think it's now heavily tilted towards second guessing and accountability on the public policy front. Are governments doing the right thing? Are the measures they're undertaking effective? Are there alternatives? Are they slow? Are they reacting politically or on the basis of sound advice? All that stuff has become the kind of traditional coverage media brings to politics and government, rather than what they, in my view, should be bringing to coverage of a public health emergency.
They turn everything into a political issue. I mean, journalists in the galleries mostly know politics, right? There aren't subject matter experts the way there once were. Everybody just, so doesn't everything just become a political issue?
Well, I guess, but it shouldn't. And we have to be conscious of the impact of what we do as journalists. I keep referring myself as a journalist. I haven't been for 30 years, but I teach it. I think that we arrogate to ourselves a level of expertise and privileged entree into a discussion of these things. And we say we're doing it on behalf of the public. But I think that often, with notable exceptions, and there are true experts in the media community, we're overreaching. We are following, the public discourse by relatively uninformed people, sometimes by informed people. We are accelerating the debate. We think it's useful to have experts debate each other on the efficacy of things, because it increases the temperature, increases the salience, makes it more newsworthy, but also ends up confusing people. I read your plaintive tweet the other day saying, I don't understand what government objectives are here. That's a legitimate complaint. If government won't articulate it, then what ends up happening is media press on it. and then they divide because we have more media with a vested interest on a kind of minor partisan level than is really healthy, in my view.
What does that mean?
Well, we've blurred the lines between normal reportage and opinion. And we now have people who straddle the line. They are opinion columnists on one day or express opinion on one day on programs or podcasts. They're reporters on the other. They develop a kind of vested interest in their world outlook and what they find most synchronous with the way they think. And we treat opinion columnists as go-to experts. So we've developed, over time, it's not a function of COVID, it began over time before that, where we assemble panels of journalists who pronounce on the news of the day or the governments of the day. And they've reached a kind of privileged position. The National Post, for instance, is now almost entirely made up of opinion and opinion columnists. This isn't a standard complaint about the partisanship of the National Post. That's not the issue.
The issue was a time at the CBC when you weren't allowed to have an opinion?
Well, it was in fact against the policy book. And poor David Halton, for those of you who remember it, who was the chief political correspondent of the CBC, was placed on a panel on Sunday nights with Jeff Simpson. And Simpson was a columnist, and a great one, with the Globe and Mail. And every Sunday, it was agony for David, trying to navigate his way responding to Jeff without being able to express opinion. And when he strayed over the line, he was called on. And we never put reporters in a position where they had to express opinion. Now it's almost prized, right? When you say you've got to tweet, you've got to get involved in social media, you've got to have points of view, you've got to raise the profile of the company by going on panels. You become ambassadors for your media organization by doing that. We're prizing that kind of opinion without, really looking at the qualifications of people to ascertain whether the opinions that they develop are based on real expertise.
You used to tell me back in the days of legacy media that media didn't tell people what to think, that it couldn't tell people what to think because people have their own minds, but it could tell people what to think about. It could set the agenda. What's happened to that?
It's still somewhat true, but the mainstream media share of mind among consumers of news has diminished very substantially. And with social media and alternative news sources, as we see most dramatically in the U.S., the fight for share of mind and access to readers and viewers is really brutal. So what that's meant is that we develop a variety of different agenda depending on the value or expertise of the media organization or social media platform. And when people start favoring social media platforms over traditional media or use it as a vehicle to get to traditional media, they're exposing themselves to a much wider variety of news, often tailored by them to yield what they're interested in, as opposed to what they need to know. So the old dilemma of telling people what they need to know versus what they want to know has become a kind of standard problem now in media. And even mainstream organizations, regularly on an hourly basis, kind of check through what people have been reading. They become so consumer driven by what people want to read that they lose focus on what people really need to read. You don't know what you don't know, right? And media should be filling that void. But in our work, David, in political campaigns, we we always tried to get a hold of the agenda. We always struggled for that with media, for the control of the agenda. That is, it still goes on in politics now, where media and political campaigns struggle for what the news of the day is, what the agenda is, with media often winning and setting the stage. And depending on people's media consumption habits, they are still substantially influenced by what media chooses to ask and report. The problem, or the not the problem, the circumstance is where there used to be a consensus in mainstream media about the relative importance or hierarchy of importance. That's no longer true. It may be true mostly within mainstream media. It does not apply to social media. So what social media regard as the agenda is often very different than what mainstream media does.
Then we curate our own social media. So, I mean, I had this really interesting phenomenon happen to me a week or so ago where I tweeted out a question, which was, where can I read the best justification for what appears to be the government policies now in English Canada of basically letting this thing go? This was before Ford's reversal the other day. And my Twitter feed, to my surprise, treated it as a rhetorical question. Because nobody who follows me on Twitter thought that that was a legitimate question to be answering. So people retweeted it, or they said, yeah, fucking right, there's no justification for this. The number of people that actually said, oh, here's an interesting thing to read, is tiny. So it made me think that nobody in my Twitter feed is exposed to those other arguments that, for instance, my colleague Jenny Byrne recites regularly on the curse of politics. But we're so siloed in what we learn now.
Yeah, I don't know if we're excuse me. I don't know if we're siloed, or maybe worse, that we don't expose ourselves deliberately to things that are uncomfortable or don't agree with us, because you have so many opportunities to assemble a coalition of support for your own views. You've got to be fairly strong-willed to say, I'm going to take some time now to see what the other side says. And in a media system like social media, particularly on Twitter, that prizes aggressive and sharp dialogue and smart assery, there's very little opportunity or room for the kind of redirection to try to convince people to inform themselves. And that's true on Facebook too, although Facebook allows you more interconnects usually, because your friends tend not to be as dismissive of the circumstances that Twitter people are.
Here we are, Herle Burlyites, at the time of year where I like to mix my rum and regret cocktail. I start by filling a glass with ice. Then 3 parts rum, 2 parts cola, and 1 part deep reflection on the year just passed. And then I add a single tear, just to give it that extra personal kick. I'm kidding. As we've been talking these last couple of weeks, this is giving season. The good people at TELUS who present our show believe in giving. It's a core value of the company, 365 days a year. In fact, they've been called the most giving company with contributions of over $1.2 billion to charitable organizations in Canada. Well, TELUS has a challenge for all you caring and influential Herle Burlyites to help them give more. It's a real challenge about spreading both the good word and good works, and TELUS urges you to take it up. This year, as you're reaching out to your local charitable and community organizations, shelters, senior centers, women and children's charities, and the like, if you could just make them aware that TELUS has a number of giving programs that can help so many vulnerable Canadians get connected to technology. We've talked about mobility for good and internet for good already. This week, I'd like to tell you about Tech for Good, which happens to be pretty close to my heart. Tech for Good provides individualized training and support to people with disabilities so they can independently use and get all the benefits out of their mobile devices. As you can imagine, it results in better quality of life and more personal empowerment. These programs are so important for vulnerable Canadians, Herle Burlyites. So take up the challenge and make sure your local organizations know about Tech for Good. Because when technology becomes more equal for all of us, the country is just so much better off. To find out more, go to telus.com/connectingcanada. You were at the center of things when there was this sort of command and control media. I think back to the 80s, and there was like maybe 5 English Canadian outlets that anybody cared about. There was CBC, CTV, Star, Globe, and Southam Chain. That's what you were managing. And so, yeah, and there was a general broad consensus about the issues. Was that better or worse than what we have today? I mean, we tend to look back on it nostalgically, but should we look back on it nostalgically?
That's a really intriguing question. Once you add the word nostalgia, I guess it depends on your point of view and where you sit, right? I look at it nostalgically because I was in the middle of it and could help direct it, right? So it was very satisfying professionally. We, at the CBC National, we had more than 2 million viewers a night. We set the agenda, nationally. It was ego stroking, satisfying. Was it better? I believe in a diversity of voices and a diversity of views. I think that ultimately democracy is better served by that. Is that what we have now, or do we have a cacophony of views that are contending with each other in unhelpful ways? I think that, if you look at it as a pendulum, we've probably swung to an extreme on the other side. Certainly they have in the US, where it's not a diversity of voices. You end up exposing yourself in closed loops of information where people do not expose themselves to alternate views. So it would be a whole lot better, in my view, for people to read a generally small L liberal consensus than to align themselves with contending Republican and Democratic views reflected in their news organizations. I think that with the advent of the internet and social media, there isn't any doubt that we raised the information level of most people. We taught them how to research on their own. We gave them access to tools to get more information and hopefully become more informed and balance off, various views. I think as time progressed, the social media platforms were hijacked. They're hijacked by activists. They were hijacked by trolls, and they became monetized with all of the dreadful implications that led to. Facebook, Twitter, Google's a much better example of the neutral social media platform that enables. The others are not, in my view. And what's happened is
although search is an opaque thing, right? Like what comes up on search.
Fair enough. And you're right. Because they can sell you the ability to reprioritize what you get, they are not so subtly directing what you do get. But you can work around that. I think that the proliferation of the platforms, particularly the malevolent ones or the highly partisan ones, have really leveraged diversity in a way that is very unhelpful. So, the roundabout answer was the old system wasn't perfect, but at least you had a lot of professional, thoughtful people helping to develop that consensus. And yes, I know that consensus kind of ostracized more stronger views on the right or left, and forced consensus often in a kind of centrist view. I understand the implications of that, but I think that maybe that was better than the highly polarized system that's being developed in the US and is in some ways being replicated here in Canada. Not as badly, but we're on the same trajectory.
So our sponsor, CN, likes to say that it's building the railroad of the future. That means a bunch of things: more precise scheduling, creating a more diverse workforce, acquisition of cutting-edge technology. You know, modern trains are becoming rolling computers. Safety, 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 and containing climate change, among others. On that last file, CN's relentless work on shrinking its carbon footprint is paying off. In fact, CN has just been named to the environmental A list by CDP, an international nonprofit that scores companies worldwide on their dedication to building a sustainable economy. CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. A-list means, well, A-list. This year, CDP assessed nearly 12,000 companies. 200 were singled out as high performers. Companies CDP says are leading the way to a net zero future. CN is pretty proud of that. Pretty proud. Actually, CN's approach to greening its operations is quite simple: transporting cargo with a minimal impact on our environment. Since 1993, CN has reduced emissions from locomotives by 43%, thereby avoiding 48 million tons of GHG emissions that would otherwise have gone into the atmosphere. The railway has ordered a fleet of electric trucks for the final mile of delivery and has even commissioned a battery electric locomotive. It's an indisputable industry leader in fuel efficiency and is working to lower fossil fuel consumption even further. And just recently, CN joined the Race to Zero campaign, committing to setting targets in line with the goal of holding global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. Herle Burlyites have heard me say this before. One train takes hundreds of trucks off of our highways. CN provides a greener, not to mention much more dependable, supply chain. That's what the railroad of the future means. We're very critical of the right-wing media, and Fox News is the exemplar of all this, although I saw a stat the other day that made me feel entirely inadequate as a podcaster, that Joe Rogan has an audience that dwarfs anybody on any of the cable news networks in the States. But we tend to think about Fox as being sort of this outlier of disrupting media by having such a clear agenda. Does anybody in media not have an agenda? Like, I don't know that it's as pronounced, but I know that it seems to me that CNN and MSNBC are covering for Biden, for example, in that they're much less likely than Fox is or other sources are to show Biden's daily mental screw-ups and missteps verbally. The CBC in Canada seems to have decided, by my observation, that everybody in Canada should know more about Indigenous affairs than they do, and about structural racism in Canada than they do. That's a policy agenda. Is that unreasonable?
Well, can we disaggregate the two?
Sure.
In the U.S., I think it's fair to say they are approaching an existential crisis of some sort. The last 2 weeks have been quite startling on the number of dystopian, analyses of the next 4 years in U.S. politics. I'm not saying it's misguided. I'm saying that there is a real chance of some sort of implosion in that place after the 2024 election, maybe sooner. I think it's very hard to be a member of the national media in the U.S. With a fundamental attachment to its institutions and democracy itself, and treat with equanimity some of the darker forces that are gathering on the right in the U.S. A lot of journalists would argue that even an attachment to democracy is an inherent bias that's unacceptable. I think myself that crosses a line. It is democracy that birthed free media and protects it. Anyway, I don't have to go into a civics lecture, but I think that
it doesn't exist anywhere that democracy doesn't.
Fair enough. or struggles to. So I guess in the U.S., when you've got a clear and present danger, to use the American phrase, to their system and their institutions, I think it is beholden to the national media to try to examine that, to deal with it. But also, perhaps, it's understandable that mainstream media in the U.S. becomes protective of the national institutions because they see the existential crisis looming. And if they can't support or buttress democratic impulses in the U.S., there's a cataclysm at the other end of that. The Canadian experience is very different, and I don't want to draw any parallels. We have, minor examples of the rabid right-wing media in the U.S., but they're minor and marginal. We have certainly a conservative-leaning press in post media, but I think that most organizations in Canada share a sense of the importance of central institutions and the democratic process. So that creates a fundamental divide between the two countries. The CBC question is a separate question to me.
Okay.
I think, we've all read the piece by that woman who left the CBC saying it was too woke. And she had moved from being the most left-wing person in her newsroom to most right-wing person in her newsroom. I think they're probably, that represents some parts of the CBC. CBC is a big place. It's got hundreds and hundreds of journalists, dozens of newsrooms. There's no central control in a way that forces a mindset on its journalists. It has some very competent and successful journalists who work for it, who are very traditional in their approach towards journalism. But there is a problem with the CBC, and the problem is that it exists in a competitive environment where it has to appeal to taxpayers, and the government's a shareholder, and CBC has to find a way to maintain relevancy in the current circumstance. As its audience share continues to drop, its subsidy is very large, and the political support for it is not very strong. So it flails around trying to find constituencies, trying to find people that will unite coalitions of support. It's been ever thus for the last 30, 40 years. When it moved from national icon to yet another competitor in Canadian journalism, and had to fight for its breakfast every day. But part of that meant reflecting your audience, and I think that the equity and diversity agenda that you're talking about became a kind of moral imperative at the CBC, that was hard to be a national broadcaster, subsidized or almost entirely not entirely, it has advertising, but heavily subsidized by government, and not reflect the country that you're covering. So the CBC was really among the first to break the gender barrier in the late 60s and early 70s with deliberate affirmative action hiring of women. It then moved on to more diverse communities and affirmative action programs and hiring. And it became a central corporate value to be diverse, reflect the diversity of the country on air and in its digital platforms. And the hiring reflected all that. And people tend to hire, you know, in like manners. They search out people like themselves. One of the arguments that BIPOC journalists used to make was, if you don't hire us and we're not part of your organization, there will be a whole set of issues that you won't understand and won't cover, because there are community issues. They're not your community issues in a narrow sense. And that proved to be true, right? So as you hired more and more people from diverse communities, they brought their own experiences and their own values and priorities into the system. And they began arguing at editorial meetings, at coverage meetings.
Is the argument this, Elly? Is the argument this? Because it looks like this to me. And by the way, I'm not a person who thinks woke is an entirely pejorative term, by the way. I think there's a lot we need to be woke too. But is it a dispute about what the news is? Like, it seems to me that, traditionally, CBC accepted the system and reported the transactions within the system. There's a housing crisis. Here's what the government's doing about housing. And there seems to be a new crop of journalists who say, well, that isn't the news. The news is how structurally flawed our system is that has produced this housing crisis.
Yeah. Well, that's not an inaccurate observation. But I think the roots of it are that as the CBC became legitimately a home for diverse views and diverse people, they did bring those kinds of agendas to it. And the reality is that the problems confronting Indigenous people, equity-seeking groups, are rooted in identity and are rooted in discrimination to large part. But they're also rooted in issues of poverty, an issue of government resource allocation. And I think that the dilemma the CBC is facing is a lot of its journalists have opted for coverage of the equity-seeking agenda, and the roots that they determine have caused systemic discrimination, and have moved away from covering the larger social issues, including those that impact on powerless communities or marginalized communities. I think that there is a more single-minded focus on redressing inequities than in understanding the underlying economic and social conditions and public policy. And I think, look, I'm a constant CBC radio listener, and I find myself at significant parts of the day turning off the radio because I just keep hearing the same things over and over again. And I wonder why there's no longer any significant coverage of the economy, of significant social policy. Now, I don't want to, we've got to be careful about the broad brush here. The CBC has very strong journalistic public affairs programs that are in the mainstream of their coverage. There are, in its news coverage is different than its public affairs coverage. Public affairs are the radio programs of a half hour, or 15 minutes. News are the main news stories, the newscasts of the day. They tend to be much more mainstream than the public affairs programs. A lot of the local programs are very strong local programs following a traditional local agenda that have nothing to do with the problems you're outlining. So we've got to be careful. But I think that CBC radio in particular, which used to be a national meeting ground for elite thought and discourse about major public policy issues, is not that anymore, or at least not the way it used to be. It now allows lots of discussion and access for more, I don't want to say marginal, but less majoritarian issues, more minoritarian issues. And because of their money crunch, this is something people don't focus on. They keep repeating programs within their schedules, so that over a course of the week, any particular program may be repeated 2 or 3 or 4 times. So you get the sense of being overwhelmed by an agenda, but actually what it is the same program coming at you 4 times at different times. So I think we need to do a much more sophisticated analysis, content analysis of what they're actually covering and which vehicles are covering them before you can reach a kind of broad brush analysis. But look, I don't want to gainsay the problem. I think there is a problem because I think they are no longer as rigorous a national broadcaster covering national issues of public policy in the way they were.
The National itself as a program has no audience anymore. Save it or kill it.
I worked for it for 16 years as I'm working for the network. Save it or kill it. Save it. It performs a function. CTV National News performs a function. Global National News performs a function. If a country does not have a way of accessing a common set of information on a daily basis, how do people evaluate government, public policy, and all those things if they don't share a national agenda of information?
There's only a couple 100,000 people watching the National on any given night. It's not holding anybody to account.
No. I understand your point, David, but I'm saying that the collectivity of the 3 national newscasts and Téléjournal in Quebec, perform a function. That the CBC has lost its way at that time slot, I agree. 200,000 people are insufficient, particularly with the public subsidy it's getting. But you asked me save it or kill it. Saving it means resuscitating it, right? And putting it back at the level where it is providing indispensable information and becomes an indispensable part of people's days. We all talk about the way all news has diminished the importance of appointment broadcasting. Why would you turn on at 10 o'clock when you get it all day on CBC News Network or the CTV equivalent? But the reality is that people continue to watch the CTV National and the Global National. There is a need they feel to get a one-stop shop of the day's news. And I think our system of government and our democracy depends on that continuing so that people get the same agenda information on a daily basis. It's bad enough if you live in BC and the world ends at the Rockies, right? If every part of the country is isolated and captive to its own local media, you'll get strong local governance, but you won't have much of a national, political system.
All right. Hey, I want to shift gears radically and talk to you about government now instead of journalism.
Right.
So you've had this unique vantage point of spearheading the national coverage of governments as a journalist, and then going into the inside and being right in the heart of government decision-making. What surprised you the most about government as a journalist? As somebody who covered it, what did the reality of government surprise you the most?
How little I knew about it. I was the bureau chief, Parliamentary Bureau Chief for the CBC for 16 years. I managed the stable of the top journalists in the country for years. We thought we understood government. We didn't really, tell you the truth. We understood the surface. We understood what government told us to regard as important. We often did hold them to account, but I think that we always underestimated the degree of work inside government, the thoughtfulness of people within government, and frankly, the importance of government. I think the role of government is something media finds it hard to understand because it's so broad and so complex. When I started working inside, number one, I realized that as a generalist reporter, I was highly successful in understanding this part of the agenda, right? When I got inside, that lasted a day and a half because that level of information was, one PowerPoint briefing deck, for for somebody in power. So
Although
guess,
I think we invented PowerPoint, didn't we, Elly?
But the reality is that I think that the policy development process was a lot more complicated than I understood, and more sensitive in some ways. There was the disheartening side was a lot of the suspicions we had, or I had, about incapacity, about wrong-headed stubbornness, about the inability to move from A to B without zigzagging, turned out to be in part true, maybe largely true in some places. You and I had a marvelous time in the true exception in government when we were in finance for 15 years, or 13 years, whatever it was. That was an elite bureaucracy of extraordinarily capable people operating, virtually in defiance of the system. I think that over time that has diminished very substantially. I think that the impulses in government still are, at worst benign, and usually more compassionate and sensitive than people understand. Their ability to translate that into public policy and implementation, is harder and harder. I'm not going to say anything people haven't heard before, but when more than half of the jobs in government are about compliance, people checking other people's work to make sure that money is being spent properly, that people are following the rules.
Is that the truth?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh. The culture of compliance within government, forced in some part, by the way, by media's absurd focus on every dollar spent and value for money, and its quickness to pounce on government misspending has created such a culture of risk avoidance in government.
What government has not had $1 billion boondoggle, eh?
Sorry?
What government has not had $1 billion boondoggle of some kind?
Well, and as you recall, we worked on $1 billion boondoggle that turned out to be a boondoggle of less than $50 million.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's so much risk avoidance and enforced compliance that it's hard to get creative discussion. And then we went through, a period where, without trying to be too partisan about it, I think the Conservatives under Harper came in with a different thesis of government, very different than Mulroney's as a Conservative, and they were quite dismissive of the bureaucracy. They paralleled structures in ministers' offices. They got rid of a lot of the policy capacity within government. They hired and brought in a lot of private sector people into senior positions who brought different value systems and management systems into government. And it all became about financial accountability, prudence, in addition to whatever the policy agenda was. And I think they ended up squeezing competent people out of government, people who were there because they were interested in public policy and were having it dictated to them by the proverbial people in short pants in ministers' offices, ended up leaving the civil service. And I think that, we're living with the legacy of both the forced compliance problem, the generational change within the civil service. I think the Liberals have tried to bring back more traditional civil servants into the system, but it takes a decade to get that kind of changeover within government. But I don't, but I'm not trying to excuse the Liberals. I think the Liberals have abused the policy process very significantly too.
Well, that sort of begs a follow-up. I was going to ask you for sort of a broad, after 6 years of observation, sort of a broad characterization of the Trudeau government's strengths and weaknesses. But let's start with that, what you just said there. How have they abused the policy process?
Well, as I reflect on it, did I use the right words? I think they have prioritized a series of issues, which is their right to do. They were elected to do it. But I think that they have been less focused on the national economy than they probably should have been over time. I think that a lot of the implementing frontline ministries got less priority than perhaps they needed to. I think, look, it's the right of any administration and government to set its major priorities. I think this government's been pretty clear about it. There is the ongoing issue behind it of whether governments that are now elected with less than 33% of the vote and act as if they have majorities, right, is an appropriate wielding of the system. But we can have that discussion at some other time. But I think that the liberal agenda got very crowded. It got very broad, and because of that, there was less focus than there should have been, in my view, on some core areas of government.
We had a fun exercise on Cursive Politics this week, handicapping the next Liberal leadership race, which isn't started yet, of course. Asking you a similar question from a different angle. Who in the current ministry impresses you? Who stands out as people that are really good?
I don't think you'll get a different list from me than you get from most people. I think I don't know how to do the hierarchy, so I'll do them as they come to mind. It's not a going down the list in order of precedent. I think Minister Wilkinson has shown very impressive ability to nurture a very difficult agenda, maintain links with the industries that are going to be harmed, or at least weakened. He's been very tough on his bureaucrats. He's a harsh taskmaster, but I think has proved to be quite effective. And he's now got a significant job at NRCan. I think I've been very impressed by Minister Anand. From a standing start as a university professor, to come in and manage 4 years later the crisis of procurement and COVID, I thought was an astonishing success. And I think putting her in defense has been an indication of the competence people see in her. I agree with your assessment of Marco Mendicino that you guys went through yesterday. Or this week, whenever you did the podcast. I think he's been, again, from a relative standing start as a Crown prosecutor. He's worked his way into a very competent minister, leaving behind the magnificent accomplishment of actually hitting the $400,000 immigration level, 400,000 people immigration level last year. Everything I hear about Chrystia Freeland is an active mind, real grasp on the issues, an astonishing international network. She appears to be in full command of the kind of economic and fiscal agenda. I'm a little uncomfortable, frankly, combining a deputy prime minister and finance minister in the same role. One responds to the overall priorities of government. The other one has a more limited role in protecting the fiscal integrity of the country and providing economic direction. I think putting the two together required extraordinary ability, an ability to separate kind of mentally the two things. We'll see. Her big test is coming. The budget is their big test, and we'll see if she does. Frankly,
is she the new Jerry?
Is she the new Jerry?
Is she the new Jerry in terms of the source of ideas and policy focus and where the direction of where the government's going?
I'm not close enough to actually understand that. I think that Katie Telford, the current chief of staff, is still the primary gatekeeper in a way that Minister Freeland can't be. But look, she is the deputy chair of the most important cabinet committee. Something that, in our day was not contemplated. You couldn't put a finance minister there. Although I guess Mazankowski in 1 year of finance minister and DPM did it. I don't know the degree to which she influences more general policy outside the financial stuff. Everything you hear is she does. She is not at the same status as the rest of her colleagues. She has extraordinary access to the prime minister, but I'm not privy to those conversations. I don't know.
Were you done with your list, or did you have anybody else you wanted to add to your list?
As I was doing it, I was searching my mind, and frankly, nobody else came to mind. And I'm sure there are people who should have. So I'm happy to respond. But I guess maybe the health minister, Duclos. I think he's a straight shooter. He's not a great communicator, but he's a straight shooter, and he's transparent. And in the current circumstance, I far prefer listening to him because I don't believe I'm getting very much spin out of it. And I think I'm hearing, a thoughtful person think. But that may be because I know he's a health economist and he probably has special expertise.
Why don't they let them talk more? Every single minister who's come on the Herle Burly, people have said, holy Christ, that person is smart. That person has interesting ideas. That person's articulate. That person has an interesting background. That person impresses me. And it's because they get to talk for an hour and say things that they think and that they believe, and they're not on talking points. Why does the government have their cabinet on 24/7 talking points?
Oh, David, that's such a complicated question. It's not. It takes us back to the journalistic discussion, right? How many opportunities do ministers have to have an hour-long conversation in detail with anybody in the public domain? That's not going to end up edited, chopped, and retransmitted in some way. There's so few platforms for that. And, you do strategic communications the way I do it, right? A lot of it is risk avoidance, right? Is this the time to go out on the limb and establish yourself in a proactive way? Or is it a lot safer not to do that, right? Who's listening, right? So somebody stands up in question period and gives you a straight answer, right? The audience is 4,000 people. Media will not find it interesting or attractive. It won't get replayed. Are you a tree falling in the forest? If we provided significant opportunity for it, then I think people would rise to it. But when everything is chopped and sliced, the dangers in the cost-benefit analysis always comes out in the wrong way. The opportunity to screw up or to be misrepresented is so much larger than the opportunity to be properly understood. So, you've got to have real nerve, and you need permission to take the risk, right? And there are no governments that I recall in the modern era, in the last 20 or 30 years, that have allowed ministers that kind of independence. You probably have to go back to the Trudeau the Elder's government with some of his senior ministers.
What about Chrétien? What about Chrétien? So I don't think anybody who followed politics closely had any trouble identifying the fact that Paul Martin and Lloyd Axworthy were working on different things, had different agendas, different priorities, and were going to be arguing different things at the cabinet table. I think that was a strength for the government, that people could see those differing opinions being played out and argued for within the government. If anybody in the current government has even a slightly different take on anything from another minister, I have no idea.
The question is, I guess, are you being overly romantic about the Chrétien period? We could remember lots of times when, Peter Dinolo would call Terry and say, how could your minister have said that, right? So, in many ways, it was Paul's, you picked the two people, Paul and Lloyd Axworthy, who couldn't be controlled, right? And to Mr. Chrétien's credit, he allowed that to persist until he didn't, right? Until, Paul got quit. But that's the unusual circumstance. There's not a lot of people in that ministry, other than those two, who people would have had a sense of what they thought and where they differed. But yes, Mr. Chrétien allowed it because, look, he was dealing with majority government. Let's not forget, he never had a minority government, right? He was always politically invulnerable. So his ability to sustain...
Until he wasn't.
Sorry?
Until he wasn't.
Until he wasn't. But his ability to sustain that kind of conflict internally was easier. A minority government, a little tougher.
Brother, we are out of time. I can't believe it. I could go on for hours and hours. In fact, we're almost certainly going to have to reconvene this because there's half the things on my list I wanted to talk to you about I didn't get to. But I'm going to end with a question that if I've ever asked you, I haven't asked you for a long time. Is there anything we could have done differently to keep Paul in office longer? Is there an obvious mistake we made?
Oh, my. We can re-argue again the decision to set up the Gomery inquiry. At the time, I strongly supported it. I think I still do. I think it allowed Paul to leave government knowing he had done the right thing. But look, there's no doubt how politically damaging it was. Were we right in collectively arguing that he should resign after his loss in 2006? Don't know. We had over 100 seats. Harper's minority was not the strongest minority.
A great candidate in 2008.
Sorry?
He'd have been a great candidate in 2008 in the middle of the economic crisis.
Yes. And I think that by then he had graduated to elder statesman, best finance minister in the history of the country status. And you're right, in 2008, given the crisis, he might very well have been reached out to as a savior. We were too quick to worry about the review, the possible leadership review, and what it would put him through. Curiously, I don't think telling secrets out of school, we suggested he resign. His family thought they could live with the controversy and wanted him to stay, right? I think that was a mistake. I think Gomery ultimately created a problem. And I think the third thing that we couldn't have helped, but should have been able to influence was that the minority government, the 2004 to 2006 government, didn't move quickly enough and decisively enough. We should have gotten to Kelowna and the childcare agreement 6 months earlier.
Well, that's food for thought, Elly, especially Gomery. There's a lot invested in changing your mind about that.
Yes, there is. And
yeah.
And I'm not sure I fully changed my mind on
it. Thanks for this. Tons of wisdom and perspective. Everything I hoped it would be as a conversation. Thanks for doing it, and I hope you will come back on.
Great. Thanks for having me, David, as they all say. I've enjoyed it very much, especially for an hour in the morning. Take care.
Yeah. I'd like to thank in addition to Elly Alboim, I'd like to thank all the people who watch and listen to the Herle Burly. Please, as I said, go to Apple and give us a rating or a review. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Ellys, and our sponsor, CN Rail. See you for another Herle Burly next Wednesday. Take care.